I'll do my best. We're starting late now, but I'll do my best.
Hello. Tous les Français et les francophones ont les trucs dans les oreilles. This is going to be in English. All right?
Yeah.
You're all set? Okay. Well, I have the pleasure and honor to introduce Don Treffinger. A lot of you know him, of course, through all the books he's written on creative problem solving and other topics around creativity. He's a family name, I think, right? And a business name, of course. He is currently director of the Center for Creative Learning in Sarasota, Florida, in the States. And before, he was a professor at Purdue University, University of Kansas. Director of graduate programs in creative studies at Buffalo State College. Buffalo. People who know CPS, Buffalo, New York, right? And co-author of more than 60 books, my goodness, and 300 articles on creativity, creative problem solving, and talent development. And there's a book here, en français, in French. So, Don, thanks for coming. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bonsoir, guten Tag, hola, or as we say in the Grand Ole Opry, howdy. I had to do that for America's birthday anyway. Steve, where's Steve? He was here before. There he is, hiding up there. I'm glad you gave them their vegetables today. I was for a moment afraid that I was going to get to play the Darth Vader role from the dark side of science. But today's been an interesting day. How many of you have been here for Steve's session and for Greg's first thing in the morning? Have you been here for all the keynotes today? This is really kind of an accumulation of some of what Greg called the basics, the very foundational kind of things. And then what Steve has showed you, some of the basic science that's going on around it. And now what my job is to help us look at some of the application side of the science. There seems to me pretty much to have been a phrase that has been missing a lot this week. And that phrase is deliberate, explicit instruction in process, method and tools. And I understand Greg's point that tools can have some dangers, but tools also have some very powerful strengths for us. And I want to illustrate that, the concern about what happens if we aren't concerned with deliberate, explicit process, with a little bit of a parallel from a cartoon. Here is the scientist talking to another one who says, I think you need to be more explicit in step 2. Now I've blocked out what step 2 is, but now you see it says, then a miracle occurs. And sometimes our approach to process seems to be that then a miracle will occur. And so I want us for a while this afternoon now to deal with the question, can we teach people to think creatively, to think critically, to solve problems, to make decisions? Now, scientists and researchers, and particularly we psychology types, like always to be very cautious about responses to big questions like this. We want to qualify and carefully guard our responses so that they're not misinterpreted. So let me give you the cautious scientific response. This is, in fact, no longer the question for us. The question, can we teach these things, is just so clearly yes, that we don't need more studies about that as such. You know what they say? One of life's tragedies is the brutal assault on a beautiful theory by an ugly gang of data. And we have all kinds of data about that. The real question now is not can we do it, but how. And that has been a part of the odyssey where we, or the journey for us, where we started out with one-size-fits-all programs, where we thought we had one process, one method that everybody could use, and everybody would use and deploy the same way. Now, what we found out about that was that those programs work. They do actually lead to successful and positive outcomes for many people in many contexts. But the journey for us has been that they could work better for all people. So the key question for us as researchers, as teachers, as trainers, has shifted from can we teach people to think creatively, instead to the question, what works best for whom and under what conditions? You see, what we're dealing with increasingly is the complex set of interactions between or among person, environment, and process. No one of those, we certainly agree, should stand by itself. And what I'd like you to do with me briefly this afternoon is to follow the journey that we've been on in creative problem solving over what is now a 5-decade tradition. So that when I say to you, there is no question about the fact that the answer is yes, I'm talking now about a 50-year-plus tradition of work. When people ask, is there research about this? The answer is yes, indeed. There are over 700 published studies by a wide variety of researchers and institutions. There is ongoing development that we're engaged in. There are worldwide applications, and we've used creative problem solving and studied it in business, in education, and in many other organizations, from young children, ages 6 or 7 or so, through to adults in the corporate boardroom. Now, the 7-year-olds enjoy it when we tell them that they're learning things that the big people also learn. The corporate vice presidents are not always as enchanted to know that we teach the same thing to 7-year-olds. Okay? Although maybe they feel better when they stop and think that someday these 7-year-olds will either be working for them or perhaps employing them. Maybe we shouldn't go there. So I'd like to take you then through a bit of this journey to help you have a context for where we are with process today. Now, if we start on this, in the late 40s and 50s, the pioneer of our approach, only one of many people who pioneered research on creativity, but from our approach, was Alex F. Osborne. Wrote in 1953 the book Applied Imagination. If you have ever used the term brainstorming, who among us might not have, you would put a little euro in Alex's piggy bank. Alex is the man who invented or coined the word brainstorming for use in creativity. He was the founder of the Creative Education Foundation in Buffalo. And he was the one who started our line of work on CPS. Now, as we moved into the 60s, our key concerns were divergent thinking and a focus on the role of brainstorming. We were perhaps so effective in that some people got the impression that creative problem solving equals brainstorming. And people would say, oh, we do creative problem solving, you know that's when you brainstorm. Now, I would imagine that many of you, especially in studies of creativity since the 60s, have encountered the term divergent thinking. How many of you have heard many times before the term divergent thinking? Right? Good 60s term. So my first message is that if people are thinking about creative problem solving primarily in terms of brainstorming and are still working primarily on issues about divergent thinking, that's a nicely entrenched position in the 1960s. Now, does it work? Would it still work? Yes. Is it the best we can do? I don't think so. It's a little better than a friend of mine who managed to buy 100,000 1967 calendars for only €1 a piece. He thought it was a great bargain because he said if 1967 comes back again, he's going to make a killing on it. There might be a flaw in that logic. Now, where did we go from that beginning point? Into the 60s, Sid Parnes joined Osborne and started working on attempting to make CPS usable as an instructional methodology. And in the good fashion of scientific diagrams, and I was glad that Steve had several charts and diagrams there this morning. I want to show you the very formal scientific diagram of CPS in the 1960s. This was the Parnes spiral rendition of creative problem solving, where we started in the center with a mess. Now, Mr. Translator, I don't know what mess is going to be in any other language. Mess? Mud puddle? Eh? I had a student one time who talked about a concern here. She said, oh, Dr. Treffinger, in this book about CPS, they use this Greek term all the time, and I don't know any Greek. And I said, Greek term, what are you talking about? She said, yes, messes. M-E-S-S-E-S, messes. And I said, you mean messes? And she said, oh, like a mud puddle? And I said, yes, exactly, you've got it. We started with the idea of the messy situation. You're in a muddle, things aren't working the way you want them to, you aren't where you want them to be, you want to make things better. And then Parnes defined 5 steps in problem solving. And at this point, with this spiral model, This was a linear sequence of steps, all with the phrase finding, fact finding, problem finding, idea finding, solution finding, and acceptance finding. And then that led, in turn, to new problems and new challenges. Solving one problem often opens the door for many other problems to be discovered. Now, as we moved into the 70s, what started to happen was that our key concerns were to be able to package this material, to take this descriptive process of CPS and put it together in some organized fashion that would make it suitable for an instructional program. And the original instructional programming was for adults and then for secondary students. And as we went along later, it moved downward into primary age students. And we worked on, and Parnes and his associates worked on elaborating and expanding the CPS model beyond that very informal spiral diagram. That led Parnes and his colleague Ruth Knoller, whom Ken told you about yesterday a bit, worked a lot in the area of mentoring, and we're sorry that we just lost Ruth this year, just a couple of months ago, at 85. But they developed in the 1970s a curriculum package called the Guide to Creative Action that became a teaching tool for creative problem solving for college students and for adults. This approach to creative problem solving is the approach that was used when people in education started to create a program, now an international program, still in operation, and a very good program for kids, called the Future Problem Solving Program, which now operates in at least a dozen countries around the world. But Osborne Parnes came to be known as the work that Knoller did with Parnes, and they took the same basic steps. Now I've abbreviated them here just with FF, that's fact finding and problem finding and idea finding and solution finding and acceptance finding. And they drew them, and you can see a very linear sequence here. You start with some kind of problem awareness or some kind of mess or general goal, and sequentially you go through each of these steps in a very deliberate way until hopefully some beautiful solutions roll out at the end. Now, what happened as we continued that work is that we discovered, and if I go back for just a second, there was so much happening at this front end of the process. There were so many things happening with the problem sensitivity and the mess and the objective. All these people variables started to come in and clutter up our nice, neat little process. But they were all just very informally lumped together. So in the 80s, what we started to do was to make them a new and sixth stage in the model. And to be consistent with the language, we started to talk about that as a mess finding stage. We also, at that point in the early 80s, changed part of the language from fact-finding to data-finding. Now, I don't know if the translation, the distinction between fact and data will carry the same implication that it does for us in English. But what we saw happening is that when people talked about fact-finding, that gets all wrapped up in truth issues. Is it the correct fact? Did you state the facts correctly? Are you certain and do you know what's happening? And it was not usually those that made a problem situation messy for us. What made problems challenging and complex and difficult for people to deal with was not the part about what was factually verifiable, but it was the stuff that we were uncertain about, that was ambiguous about, where we had to look at a variety of sources of data, a variety of kinds of information and impressions and feelings and concerns and things that made us ill at ease. So data finding seemed to open that door better for us than just talking about fact finding. And at that point, before that development in the 80s, we used to treat creative problem solving as one stage of generating information and ideas, or in the language we use then, one kind of diverging after another. And in every step you diverged, you got lots of information out, and you filled up lots of flip chart papers, and then you went to the next step, and you took all of that stuff with you, and you started diverging and brainstorming again, and you filled up more sheets of flip chart paper, and then you went to problem finding, and you started diverging again and generating all kinds of problem statements. You can see that the flip chart paper makers are happy with that. Right? It would be nothing unusual for us to spend 3 or 3.5 hours working on one situation and have 35 or 40 sheets of flip chart paper strewn all over the room. Now, what would happen at the end of that? Pardon? We were lost in the data. Yeah, we got to the point where we would almost drown in our own divergence. Right? We would be inundated with this profusion of ideas, and we would be exhausted. But hopefully, as we went through that, some good ideas would still emerge. So in the 80s, what started to happen is we said, no, there needs to be a balance. And at that point, we were still talking about diverging, but also saying converging in every step of the process. You see, in the original version, we had all this diverging going on, and then at the very end, if we had any time left and we weren't too tired, someone would say, now we've got to converge on this. What out of all this stuff are we going to converge on? And we said it would be much more efficient if we didn't have to wait to the end to do all that converging. If we would generate some ideas, do some diverging, but then focus and say, out of what we just generated, what's worth taking with us to the next step? So we started to see the idea of what Sid Parnes called the dynamic balance between creative and critical thinking, or divergent and convergent thinking. But a funny thing started to happen along the way in the 80s. We became aware that it was people who were doing this process. You know? Sometimes one of the nice things about psychology is that eventually we do discover what is the intuitively obvious. And sometimes that can help too. It isn't always wrong. So we started to say, maybe we need to be looking at some dimensions of how people differ in the way they're using the process. Now, we were still pretty much convinced at that point that after all these years of work, we had the process steps down pretty cold. We said, hey, we know these are the process steps. And it was as if, in a way, we were saying to people, we don't care much about how you're feeling about it. We've got this beautiful process. Don't screw it up. Right? People, being what they are, kept telling us, what if we did it some different way? But at least at this point, we were thinking in the 80s about ways that we could work with and strengthen the structure of the process. So we did a couple of things. First of all, we turned the model from the horizontal orientation to a vertical orientation. And then secondly, we added specific descriptions of what ought to happen in each of those stages when you're doing the diverging and then when you're doing the converging. So the diamond shape was not just a pretty graphic. The diamond shape was intended to demonstrate for us the fact that there is this alternation, this balance between reaching out for ideas and possibilities and then closing in with the converging. But still, if you look at it, it's linear and sequential. You start at the top, it's like a marble drop, like a pinball machine. You drop the problem in at the top, and it goes boing, 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 and pinballs down, and down at the bottom now rolls out the gorgeous solution. Right? Now, as we went along, we came into the 90s, and we had now two concerns that we started to focus on. First of all, we said we need to get beyond just relying on brainstorming. We need to expand the basic toolbox that we have. And secondly, we need to break up the linear model. Now, in doing that, in 1994, we published the first edition of a new textbook called Creative Approaches to Problem Solving, and a light version of that called Creative Problem Solving: An Introduction. It was Scott Isaacson and Brian Dorval and myself who continue to be the collaborators in the writing on the textbook side of the process here. As we started to expand that basic toolbox, we still incorporate brainstorming, but we began to incorporate a number of variations on brainstorming. We started talking about brain writing. We started talking about brainstorming with Post-its. We started talking about in and out brainstorming. There are probably a dozen different variations of brainstorming that groups can use. Now, that turned out to be, incidentally, especially helpful when we were working with children. Okay? Because with kids, you know, when you teach them something like brainstorming, and now they come back next year, and you say, oh, guess what, boys and girls? We're going to do brainstorming. What do they say? Oh, do we have to do that again this year? We did that last year. Huh? Well, I hope that at least they have some different problems this year for it. But we said, no, there are lots of different ways to do brainstorming. There are also some other tools that we can use for generating options. Now, if you ask what are some examples of those, they are force fitting, idea checklist, or the Scamper tool that I expect some of you have probably heard about or or read about. Scamper is another one these days, like brainstorming, that is often presented as if it were an entire creative problem-solving method. And all we see it as is a helpful and useful tool, and one, in fact, of many tools for generating ideas. Then also the morphological matrix. How many of you know what a morphological matrix is? Anybody? Well, let's see if we can try one quick. I don't know, let's just try it. Let's think about a story. Okay? Did you ever, I don't know now, do we have corporate folks in here? Tessir, do we have corporate, or is this all the education folks? How many of you are business people? Are there any here? Okay, few. How many, most of you are educators? Yes? Yes? Educators, can I see, show of hand? Okay. Did you ever talk to kids and ask them to write a story about something and they say, I don't know what to write about? How many of you ever had that? Or they're going to do a project and they say, I don't know what to do my project about? Okay? Let's see if we can do a story here quick. First of all, there has to be a character for our story. You all have a plain sheet of paper? Can somebody nearby you, a couple of you together, you can share, you can look on together. Make a column here and call it character. And what I'd like you to list is 8 or 10 different characters. People or animals or things that could be the main character in our story. List about 10 of them if you can. Who or what, real or imaginary, living or dead, could be a main character in our story. And just list them down the column. Do it collectively with a couple of you if you want to. Okay, now, have you got 10? You got 10? Close enough. I don't want to use too much time here. If you're able to, if the paper's loose, will you bend that column out of the way so you can't see it? We kind of hide it, or put another piece of paper over it. And the second column now, we will call place. Place. And I would like you to try to list now. Don't think about the characters. Forget about the characters. Just any 10 places where a story might take place. At the zoo, at the University of Paris Descartes, in your classroom. List 10 different places where a story could take place. Okay, do it as quickly as you can. I don't want to take too much time here. But now, fold it over again. And we're going to do 2 more columns. The third column will be goals. Goals. What things might be goals for your story? Live happily ever after. Solve the mystery. Win the prize, get rich, find love, find lust. List 10 possible goals for a story. Okay, now fold it over for the last time. Last column. Last column is, let's look at obstacles. Obstacles, things that could go wrong or create problems for us. A tornado. Our in-laws, your mother-in-law. An outlaw. Or a bylaw. A snowstorm. Being paid too much. Not being paid enough. List 10 obstacles. Okay, now, before you unfold your paper, I'd like each group, each little team of you working on this together, to pick a 4-digit number. A 4-digit number. 3, 4, 2, 6. Whatever. A 4-digit number. 4 numbers in a row. Then open up your paper. Open up your paper and look at all the choices. Your first number is your character. Count down. Your second number is your goal. Count down. Your third number that you picked, count down. That'll be, or the second one is your place. The third one is your goal. The fourth number will be your obstacle. Right? Put them together. Put them together and you've got a story. Okay. Now, let's see. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Are you back with me? If you had 10 in each column, can I have you back now? Hello. If you had 10 in each column, how many combinations would there be? There would be 10,000 combinations. So you have 10,000 possible stories on your little sheet here. Just mixing and matching one from each column, right? Now, I've seen teachers do this for story writing, for mathematics projects, for conversation practice in language, for improv and creative dramatics, for science projects. There are just so many different ways that you can use this as a way of generating many possible new possibilities. I only use the 4 numbers for you to get a random combination. If you get one you don't like, throw it away and take a different one. With 10,000 possibilities, you have lots of choices from which to select. So this is the tool we call morphological matrix. Just as a quick example of another tool for, what happened? We lost the microphone. How did we do that? Okay, now we're back. 10,000 possible ways to use a tool here now other than just basic brainstorming. Right? Now, the other thing we started working on with all of our fixation in the 60s and 70s and 80s on brainstorming and divergent thinking, we forgot the fact that unless you also focus your thinking, bring some analysis and judgment into play, all those ideas won't do you any good. So we also worked on generating a whole set of tools, or creating a whole set of tools for focusing your thinking. Okay? We losing something here?
Take this one for just a minute.
Okay. We have also said that after you generate ideas, you need to focus your thinking. Now, if you just think about taking a picture with a camera, if your camera is out of focus, what happens to the picture? It's not a good picture. It's not clear. It's fuzzy. Well, the same thing, after you generate lots of ideas, you need to focus your thinking to get clarity about your decision and your path of action. Now, you hear, and you've heard other people saying this morning, we need to have a balance of both imagination and judgment. Or we talk about diverging and converging. You see, the language we're using now is generating and focusing. Our effort has been to try to make our language more natural and less jargon-oriented, more comfortable for any people to be able to learn and use. So we're talking now about generating and focusing. The other thing that happened was we said we needed to start breaking up the linear prescriptive model. And so in the 1994 book, we started, instead of a fixed linear sequence of stages, we started to describe 3 components in problem solving, the red, yellow, and green around the outside here. And then in the center, we talked about task appraisal as a way of managing or organizing those components. I'll defer talking about these for just a minute because I'd really rather talk about where we are now with that today. This was our first effort in '94 to break up that fixed, linear, demanding, prescriptive sequence. Now, as we moved into the 21st century, our key concerns have been really going back to work much more strongly on this question of customizing or personalizing the way we use process. To stop treating the people in this equation as though they were noise, or as though they were what the psychologist wants to call error variance, and starting more and more to realize that they are essential players in the process, and that how they are going to use process is not necessarily identical across all people and situations and tasks. So we've looked at characteristics of creativity differently, and we're starting to realize more things about the importance of style. Secondly, we've been continuing to work on making the language of CPS more natural and more descriptive, to break away from some of the old language like fact-finding and problem-finding and converging and diverging, and moving toward more user-friendly kinds of language. Now, characteristics, first of all. We used to talk about a long list of characteristics of the creative person. And in fact, one graduate student of mine tried to compile a list of all of the things we could find in the literature that had been described as characteristics of creative people. We found over 300 different characteristics that appeared someplace in the literature, a number of which were contradictory to each other. That is, if you were one, you couldn't possibly also be the other. Now, the creativity characteristics people were ingenious about that little problem because they made up a 301st, then I guess, that said tolerance of ambiguity, and said you can manage, the creative person can manage the opposites within his or her own personality. So that, I guess, was supposed to wave away the contradiction. And then, you see, after we got all this list of characteristics of the creative person, as though only the creative person had those, we started wrestling with the question of, well, who is a creative person? And as you've already heard today, and you've heard also from Bob Sternberg and from Joe Renzulli, all of us are at least potentially creative people. Creativity is not just a special gift of a small number of people, but something that can emerge and be evident or manifest in the behavior of all of us. So we started to take another look at personal characteristics, and in 2002, through the National Research Center at the University of Connecticut, through Joe Renzulli's shop, we did a report on assessing creativity in which we reviewed that literature and talked about 4 different sets of characteristics that can be activated when people's creativity is energized, when people are behaving creatively. But along the way to doing that, another change started to hit us. As we started looking at learning style and cognitive style, we started to realize that in the past, almost all of our research questions were governed by the assumption that what is important is your personal level of creativity. Are you high, average, or low on creativity? And so we at first went looking for the official set of learning style characteristics that creative people would have that would make them different in learning style from uncreative people. And it didn't work. It didn't work. And finally we learned that we were asking the wrong question. That instead of just asking about level of creativity, we should be asking about style of creativity. Instead of just saying, how creative am I, we should be asking, how am I creative? And when we started looking at style as a moderating variable on how people express and use their creativity, that opened up some significant new directions for us, which today we talk about as measures of problem-solving style. And this is our official definition of problem-solving style. This will not be on the test, so you don't have to memorize it, right? Operationally, let's talk about what's involved in it very briefly. We see 3 dimensions of problem-solving style. The first we call orientation to change. And in this dimension, there are 2 styles, one of which we call the explorer. Explorers are focused on doing new things. They love lots of ideas. They love wild and crazy ideas, and the more of them, the better. I'm certain you have all heard people say, creativity is thinking out of the box. Yes? Everybody? Yeah? Creativity is thinking out of the box. That's a beautiful explorer statement of creativity. But unfortunately, it only tells us half the story. Because you see, the other style here is what we call the developer. The developer can be creative too, but in a different way. The developer's creativity is focused on adding value to what's already there and wants to deal with change gradually and carefully and incrementally. They want to be able to say, I may not come up with brand new out-of-the-box ideas, but I will take ideas and make them better with my creativity. I am good at thinking better inside the box. And both of those are creative, but they can be creative in different ways. Right? Now you see, I believe that in much of the creativity literature heretofore, including some contemporary renditions, we still place all of the emphasis on the notion that explorers are the ones who are really creative. And that in order to be creative, you've got to be wild and crazy and out of the box. And we're saying the continuum of creative behavior, constructive responses to change, can involve both explorer and developer's creativity. The second dimension we look at is manner of processing. There are some people who do their best thinking with their mouths open, do their best thinking while they're talking to other people. And they might say, this might be a half-baked idea right now, but if we talk about it and work on it together, we can make it a better idea. And they want to do that quickly. They want to get right at it. They want to be able to start social interaction about their creative ideas. On the other hand, there are other people whose approach is more one of internal processing. They say, I need to think about it for myself, work my way through it before I am ready to share it with other people. Eventually, I will share it. I need that interaction with others. I'm not talking about being a hermit here. When they say, I need to get it organized in my own head for myself before I can engage productively in a conversation with other people. Third, there is what we call ways of deciding. Some people are person-oriented. They seek harmony and good relationships. They want people to play nice together. They want the group to build consensus and to work in good harmony, and they want everybody to be on board with the solution. There are other people who are more task-oriented to begin with, and they want the logic, the best quality solution, and if the people aren't on board with it, they better get with the program. Now, in a lot of situations where we have a lot of task-oriented people, there will still be some person-oriented individuals sitting over on the side crying, right? We need to balance them both. We need to be concerned with good relationships and the ability to work together and collaborate. We also need to be concerned with the quality of solutions. We need the best of both of them working together. So we've started to see that people will define problems differently, that they will use CPS differently, that they will apply tools differently and prefer different tools depending on the pattern of style preferences that they bring into the situation. So we describe creative problem solving today this way. We have the three components around the outside. We now call them understanding the challenge, generating ideas, and preparing for action. Right? You heard this morning and previously about some things about the basics and the environment. That's part of what we're doing in planning your approach and appraising tasks. Looking at the people who are involved. Looking at the climate of the group that's involved. Looking at the goals that we're setting and how we structure them. And doing the metacognitive processing, managing the process while it is in process. Now, this can look a little intimidating, so I want to quickly take a metaphor. I imagine you all know Microsoft Office, yes? Everybody pretty well familiar with Microsoft Office. What are the big three pieces? Word, Excel, and gosh, we can't forget PowerPoint, can we? Right now, do you always use all three of those? No? No? Bill Gates would be disappointed. Right? How do you know which one to use? It depends on the task. It may also have something to do with your expertise with them. Right? But it certainly, importantly, depends on the task. If you want to crunch numbers and draw charts, where are you probably? In Excel. Right? Now, if I go back to this framework and ask how do we manage our way through it, I can tell you that in the same way we might manage our way through Office, if we need clarity about what the problem is, we ought to be working in understanding the challenge. If we have a clear view of the problem, but we need ideas, we need to be working in generating ideas. And there may well be times when we already have lots of interesting and promising ideas, but what we've got to do is make them workable. Did you ever have what you thought was a really great idea, except for one little problem? You couldn't get anyone else to go along with you? Right? So if you need action, then you need preparing for action.